Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, today it's about Dr. Navina Jafa and her book. So let's get started because as it is, we are on the wrong side of time. So tell us, what was your experience at the Smithsonian and how that prompted you? Because I see from your constant, the theme in the book is about your experiences at the Fulbright Scholarship and how that led to the writing of this book.
So I was inspired by my guru, Professor Narayani Gupta, who actually started Heritage Walks as part of Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay's work in environmental awareness in the city of Delhi. And that was the first time I actually understood what is Heritage Walk. It was only when I went to the Smithsonian at the Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage, which is not a museum per se, but it's a research center, and they have one exhibition, the Folk Life Festival, once a year. So the first time I entered, they said, oh, the gorillas who do this one exhibition once a year. And it was a wonderful experience because politics of exhibiting cultures. They had already planned exhibitions with Bhutan, for instance, 10 years ahead. And how they sent out people they were doing a Mekong, another program on the Mekong Basin. And how the scholars went to Mekong, covering the various river countries. And they were going in, collecting the intangible heritage, documenting, empowering them of how the skills need to be mapped, how the skills need to be exhibited, what is the sustainability, how will the income generation come, and how do you link them with different economic sectors? Would you like to do that with tourism? Would you like them to do that through museum? One other fact that today there's a huge race for creating museums in India. But the Smithsonian looks at the idea of backward integration. Before making a museum, do a survey. Who and why will people want to come there? Who will consume it? Who will consume culture? Otherwise, you go somewhere, it's after a human being, his razors are there, his mustaches are, whatever, his hair, his pillowcases are there. Who's interested? Nobody's interested. So how do you develop stories? How do you build skill building? And it's a continuous process. So those are the kind of inward way of getting into communities, making them speak for themselves, talking about their self-representation. How do you bring in communities around a monument? And I think the Aga Khan experiment with Humayun's tomb is one of the biggest success stories of this country, where they allowed the Basti people around to be participating in the understanding of their perception of that monument. So that is what I try to indigenize in India in the immersive experience. And I mean, just now, for instance, I went to Zanskar and to Ladakh amongst the Pashmina goat herders, and I took books there. And I've done intense documentation where they are talking about their problems. And now I'm hoping that a committee is developed in Ladakh, where there's over-tourism, as you know, that there are better methods of sharing the Pashmina wool, more facilities for the nomads. How do you do the pull factor that they feel the pride of retaining those cultures and not wear jeans and wear their clothes, sing their songs and not Bollywood songs? So how do you give that back to them, that sense of self-respect?
So, Navina, the Smithsonian, got you thinking on how to present heritage scapes, as you call them, the interaction with the community, how to build capacities, the local level, everything. Now, after that, you came back and you have traveled extensively throughout India in different parts. And some of that you have shared with me also in the past. So, of these experiences, what do you think? Can you name a few that stood out when you went and, when you saw the actual practice compared to what you had learned?
I think one of the greatest museums I've come across recently, which is coming up very well, is the Bhopal Museum, the Tribal Museum. That is a museum where they've got communities doing their narrative. Like, for instance, when you enter the museum, they have this huge thing on the Narmada. Different to the idea of Amarkantak or Maheshwar or anything, you know. It is about how the Gonds look at Narmada. And it is that self-representation of that river that is so much more important. I think that's one of the museums which is a very well-organized museum, because in Bhopal you have the Begums of Bhopal, and then you have, the lakes of Bhopal and so much more. But this self-representation, I think, stands out as one of the big examples. Another is the self-representation before the Run of Kutch festival happened in the Salt Desert. And that was amongst the Muthwa tribes there itself, which now, unfortunately, the overuse and the lack of environmental awareness in Kutch, in the Salt Desert, has been detrimental. I mean, has not been so positive. That time when I had gone, the self-representation was, and the community head, the Muthwa tribe, he said, there's that bunga. Bunga is the local hut. That is where there's a television. Everyone will continue doing their herding. They had a factory there where people had livelihood, factory, I think, built by Tatas or somebody. But you will continue wearing your clothes. You will continue singing your songs. You will continue, and only once a week will the television be opened. So people really worked very, very hard to sustain. But ever since the Salt Desert Festival happened, that got fractured. So there has to be some kind of way where we need to strengthen that.
You know, while introducing you, your son said that you wear many hats, some of them at the same time, some of them differently. And I think initially you were a dancer, and then you came on to this. Is there a connect? Or
Yes.
do you do them at the different times?
No. So when I went to the Smithsonian, they had one of the scholars saying, let those instruments sing. Do not capture them and make them into a shelf piece. And I said, well, I do that all the time. You know, once a dancer, always a dancer. For me, it was always about performing heritage. And that's what I do. So when I curate, I need the slightest occasion and I start my dance. I mean, bas button dabane ki zarurat and madam starts, you know. So whether it is, it's as abstract as when you're going to Ajanta and the local man says, in the Syadri Hills, this is where, you have the sandalwood trees and you have this, you have that. And I said, okay, can I do a Geet Govind there with the sandalwood tree there? And I just switch on something and I start dancing. So it's how to make monuments alive. How do you make stones come alive? And that's what performing heritage, and it all came from Smithsonian, which I was already doing, but it just sort of came alive.
So have any of your heritage walks involved an element of dance also?
Yes, of course. All of them are involved. And I think what also happened was, like, the first time I tried this, like the Ramzan walk, or I did the walk in Mehroli. So for the Delhi government, the Shahjahanabad Redevelopment Corporation. Or even better than that, I became the Bhopu Wali Madam. Every Sunday, Sheila Dikshit ji had asked me to be a heritage consultant. So every Sunday, I would land up in Old Delhi with the Lal Bhopu and said, the madam has come to tell the stories to all the footpath dwellers. And I would begin ideally by dancing, something or the other. It could be a song which I had picked up in the gullies, or it could be just enacting the role of that elephant, which Shah Jahan's elephant would come and take the ghante wala laddu. So I would just do the laddu dance, and so just I didn't realize that became so popular, Arvind, because once I was in Hazrat Nizamuddin Dargah and the phool wala said, "Aap phool aise hi le jaiye. Roz to aap humko har Sunday ko kahani sunati hain."
So now we've covered the background. Smithsonian, your visits, the interface with dance. Now tell us about the book. How did you get to writing the book?
So my first book was called Performing Heritage, The Art of Exhibit Walks, but that was limited to Delhi. And it was published by The Sage in 2012, but it was more important. Richard told me, he was visiting India. He said, all your intense studies, right from the north of India to south, east, west, that needs to be brought out. So it is that book that got expanded into this particular book. I also wanted to bring in more representation of other people's work. That was very important. So the last chapter, as Suvid also said, it has 10 case studies of people looking at heritage walks in different ways. The book also has a history of exhibiting India, right from the great exhibition in the 19th century in England to 100 years later when we had festivals of India, Apna Utsav, and how perceptions and diplomatically we were changing the perception of looking at India and the politics of it. Then there's a chapter on skill building, that when you choose to become a heritage presenter, whether you're a social scientist, you're a guide, a normal guide, or you're a historian, this becomes an alternate way of earning. It's a startup. I started this startup in the 80s, starting doing this in the 80s. Today, every second person is doing heritage walks, and they're doing it very well. They've taken new technology. There's a girl who's doing Raat Ke Afsane and very interesting work, new ways of presenting heritage. So a skill building, and I've taken important case studies of how do you do them. So whether it is the mariner in Kutch who sailed on a boat when he was 12 years old, they are taught how to gauge 12 kind of storms on the Indian Ocean. And even today, the meteorological department consults him. He's 90 years old, Shivji Karwa. And he talks about how they would take a model of a ship near Yemen. There's an island called Sakrota. And that model is offered to the Sakrota Devi. And then the monsoon would shift and they would be in Mozambique or the eastern part of Africa, and how they would return and how they would spend times. And so there's layered ways of understanding. It's fascinating. I mean, it's a never-ending kind of a thing.
I did go through the last chapter where all these 10 case studies that you mentioned are there, the walks by different people. I was very happy to see some of the places that I have been associated with. I'll just mention a few. Of course, all the 10 are excellent case studies, so I'll ask you to, at the end, to sum up and say which one stands out. But I started my career at Aurangabad. So in the early 90s, my job was to be a guide for dignitaries who were visiting Ajanta and Ellora. So that's how I started in the 90s. And when I finished at the end of my career, I went to Dholavira for the G20 meeting and to Srinagar for the G20 meeting tourism working group. And those walks along the Jhelum and at Dholavira are mentioned. So it was very fascinating for me to go through that. I'm sure the readers will like it because there's a mention of heritage walks in Kolkata, in Bangalore, in Amritsar, and also lots of places of interest in India. And I'm sure it'll be of interest to not only the readers here, but everyone who wants to know about tourism. So of these case studies, you can mention a few that you feel stand out, and what is there to look for in those places?
I think a very interesting thing is Dholavira, because like Agra's, I think the highway has completely demolished the chances Agra may have had for people to actually live there for a day, stay there for a day. Angkor Wat, you have to stay there for a day.
Do you know that a great road was made for
the road of heaven?
Road to heaven.
The road to heaven. And when you go in the summer, it becomes water. And when you go in winter, it becomes the snow, the salt desert. So Mr. Nagji, he was our guide in Dholavira. And he's from the backward caste of Meghwal. And as his name suggests, Megh, his local language, they have about 25 words only for the cloud. But what was so fascinating, and the layers of Dholavira, because it is not only merely related to the hydraulics of Dholavira, which is what sustains that site, the great Indus Valley civilization and the heritage of hydraulic engineering. What was interesting to see that Meghwals actually it was their land. They were pastoralists. And his story, how ASI involved him. And today he's a guide. Some of them are security guides. And how they were learning Hindi. And because of that, this teacher in their own community went up.
There's a very interesting anecdote of how they would cross over to Pakistan.
Nagar Pakar.
You can-
Yeah. So the idea of partition, there's so much said about the violence and of the Punjab side of the story, but very little is known about the partition and the Gujarat side or the Rajasthan side of the story. And these people, the Meghwals, had a story that every time there was a drought, they would walk in the night across the salt desert reading the stars. And this young man, Nagji, was so fascinated with Hubble telescope. And he said that vidhi, that tradition of reading the stars after the partition has gone. But some people, some of their relatives on the other side still have it. And they would go there, live in Nagar Pakar, and I never heard about this. So I went again on Google and Googleshwar, and I sort of understood what is Nagar Pakar. And that all got, fractured in the story of partition.
So for 75 years, they've not been able to go
They've
to
not been able, and they said that even when we go, we want to meet our relatives, we want to have our weddings, we want to meet, but if we take a visa, then we're not allowed to go anywhere else in the world for a long time. So that has deterred them.
So, why I asked you about these is because these bring out the stories that come around each heritage place, each heritage scape. How the communities get involved in it. How do we, uplift them and empower them or improve their skills and everything. And these examples that you've given are examples of that. But while going through this, do you think it is something that is replicable, or we can do it at most heritage locations?
Of course. I'm giving an example right now. I'm working with Shama Pawar, who runs a wonderful Kishkinda Trust in Hampi. And we had gone to Hampi, and I said that even in my small AV. So now I'm doing a curating part of it, and we are hoping to do some funding and do this, that you can take a tour on the Tungabhadra, buy the tour, and as you sail down the Tungabhadra, you have a puppeteer standing. Then you have the fisherman saying his stories about Pampa Devi and Tungabhadra. So it has nothing to do with the Vijayanagar kings. They have their own stories. And then you have the Bahurupiyas, or the traditional impersonators, take you for a ride and tell you about Hanuman. So that is the way you can sew them together, so that they have an extra income and you have another experience, immersive experience of Hampi.
So essentially what you're saying, a heritage walk is a win-win for the heritage enthusiast as well as for the local community.
Absolutely.
So over to you, to the audience, whatever else you want to tell them, and I think I've asked you enough questions for the day.
Thank you. Thank you, Arvind, for taking out the time, coming here, and more, Arvind, I just walked in, he had just taken over as Secretary Tourism, and I walked into his office with all my cattle jewelry that I love wearing. And I said, Arvind, I want to work on camels. And he said, camels? I said, yes, camels. And we can have camel tourism. But there's one in, there are all camel fairs. No, I said, no. In one particular place where you have health camel tourism, where you have camel milk for diabetes, for cancer, and people go off season. So that was another thing. But it never came about, and I'm sure the Oont will do something and it will come about. Hopefully the book does it. So there's a very nice picture of Magan Raika being kissed by a camel in my book. Please do have a look.